Welcome to life, love, insight, fertility experiences. I'm here today with Jennifer Moss, who is a lawyer, and I so admire and so appreciate her taking the time to be here today. We are going to talk just on an educational level about the legal aspects of trying to conceive and all the intricacies of it, or just all the things you should know. And also, we're going to talk about what people using donor conception might want to know and recipient parents. So, Jennifer, thank you so much for the time today. And would you like to tell people just a little bit more about yourself?
Sure. And thank you so much, Lori, for having me here. I love speaking with people and educating people. And I figure the more you know, the better. There's a lot to all of these topics. So I think we're probably just going to hit the key takeaways and hopefully that will interest people and they can then reach out further to an attorney in their area and talk a little bit more in depth about their situation. Hopefully this sends them in the right direction. So I am an attorney. I'm a fertility attorney, a family formation attorney here in New York. I practice throughout New York State, but I physically have offices to meet people in Manhattan and on Long Island, main office on Long Island. I have gotten into this area several years ago because I went through fertility issues to have my children. After lots of struggles, ups and downs, roller coasters, the whole gamut of things, trying IVF, I ultimately had my daughter 7 years ago through the miracle of surrogacy. My sister was our surrogate, and so it was a compassionate surrogacy here in New York, and it was a terrific experience.
I didn't know it was your
Um,
sister, Jennifer.
Yes, my sister was our first surrogate.
Oh my goodness.
She's a labor and delivery nurse, and she's a terrific person all around. And so that was a really special situation for us. And then years later, I had a son. He's almost 1 year old. He's just coming up on 11 months now. And he was born last year through surrogacy again. This time we matched with a wonderful, wonderful family. I say we matched with the family because it really is a family arrangement. It's not just matching with a surrogate, it's matching with her whole family. And they are down in Alabama. And my son was born in Alabama before all the craziness there with the fertility laws and with the cases that came out of there, the LePage case. But just prior to that, my son was born. And so I got into this area because I love helping other people through what can be a really scary and lonely experience.
Yeah, wow. I mean, that's incredible. What an incredible way to have both of them, And what you said is so true with surrogacy. Maybe we should just start with surrogacy. And
Sure.
since we started talking about it, thank you so much for sharing all of that. You
Of
know,
course.
two different kinds of surrogacy journeys, one with a family member and one with a family that you had just met through an agency. And legally,
Exactly.
is there a difference in those arrangements?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that when it comes to fertility law in general, everything is very, very state specific. So you have to really pay attention to the laws of the state. And so what I say for here in New York is not going to be the same as what happens in, let's say, Tennessee or Ohio or Massachusetts or anywhere else. But just when it comes to the different types of surrogacy, generally when you're doing altruistic or compassionate surrogacy, things are a little bit different. You still need a surrogacy agreement, which people are surprised by. So even though I was working with my sister, we still had a 50-page long agreement talking about the fact that she did not intend to be a parent and that we intended to be the parents and when and where she needed to be for all of the appointments and what she was expected to do throughout the pregnancy to keep her body safe and healthy. And so that is the same when it comes to an agency match. The laws are different here in New York for an agency match versus a non-agency match. Once an agency match, obviously it's a compensated donor and they're being paid for their time and the effort and the risk that they're taking with their body because pregnancy really is still a risk. And so first you want to match with someone that is not doing it just for the money and is doing it for the right reasons, which of course we did. And I think that those are the best matches, of course. But we want to outline the benefits package in there. We want to make sure that escrow is held so that payments are made properly. And so there is a whole nother layer to that. But when you come down to it, it's kind of similar because you are still doing an agency, I'm sorry, you're still doing a surrogacy agreement. And in the end, legally, you're still getting a parentage order. But the requirements that you need to follow in order to get those parentage orders, again, state by state, But in New York, it's a different set of requirements, a little bit more stringent requirements if you're working with an agency donor, someone that's a compensated donor.
So can I ask like two questions? You just said so much, it was like a huge amount of information and all important like information. And of course, every state is different. But
Mhm.
what is parentage for those people who don't know?
Sure. So parentage, when I'm talking about that, is really just shorthand for a judgment of parentage or a parentage order. And so, again, the states are all different. Here in New York, we have a process by which, after a surrogacy agreement is entered into, and somebody is usually in the second trimester of a pregnancy, things are progressing as we would want. Petition is filed in court and a request is made to the judge to get an order declaring that the intended parents, the people who are trying to have the baby, are the legal parents of that child, and confirming the fact that the surrogate is not a legal parent, but her role is as that of a surrogate. And so what this does, it's actually a court order. It can be gotten in New York before a baby's born, and in a lot of states it can, but not in all states. So we usually try to get that before the baby's born. And so it directs the Bureau of Vital Records, the Department of Vital Records in the local area where the baby's going to be born, to put the proper names on the birth certificate. And so what that does, the order confers legal parentage on the proper people. It shows who is and who is not a parent. If there was a donor involved, it would address that as well and say, okay, the sperm donor is not a parent or the egg donor is not a parent. And it would, like I said, direct vital records to put the proper names on the birth certificate. So almost every state has some sort of a process. It's usually a parentage process. In some states, it could be an adoption process. And that's why it's really important to talk to attorneys in the state where the baby's going to be born and to map this out from the very beginning.
Yeah, no, that is such important information that so many people, they kind of learn as they go, but to understand it before you go in is so much more helpful because then you know. And then the other thing that we chatted about and that I get to chat with people about is sometimes there's special things that you want in the relationship with the surrogate or that the surrogate wants in the relationship. And the importance of communicating that to your lawyer. So, we're talking about doctor's visits and maybe even I've had people talk about they don't want them to eat hot dogs, or certain types of food. That really has to be a conversation before it goes into a legal contract. Most of these things do. But what happens with that when there's special requests or just setting up the relationship with the lawyer? How does that get done?
Well, so some of these are spoken about early on with the agency. If people have very specific requests, whether it's the surrogate or the intended parents. I've had a surrogate before that said, we don't want to deliver, she and her husband, the surrogate and the surrogate spouse, they did not want the baby to be delivered using a traditional OBGYN. They wanted a more holistic approach. And so they needed to match with the right people that were going to be okay with that. And so it's important from both sides that everyone's honest and upfront from the beginning. They're honest with the agency about what their requirements are, whether it's going to be a laundry list of, do not eat this, or, do not go to this type of a medical treatment, or don't wear gel manicures or things like that. That people really do request. You want to be honest and upfront with the agency. And then when you're meeting with a mental health professional during the screening, you want to match with people that have similar ideas, or at least are okay with your ideas. The worst thing that you can do is to keep it all in. And then when it gets time for the for the surrogacy agreement to be drafted, that be the first time that everyone's hearing that, oh no, I can't go into a place with large crowds, or no, I can't get a belly button piercing or whatever. We want to talk about all these things from the beginning, but it's important to be really, really honest about what are the things that are going to concern you, and talk about that with your attorney so we can find a way to negotiate it, agree upon it, and get it into your contract. Some things are going to be a little bit overkill. We don't really want to put that laundry list. We want to have the doctors be able to consult with their patients, who really are the surrogate. We want to make sure that the surrogate is understanding the information from her doctor and from a medical perspective, but the intended parents, this is their baby, and we all understand that. And so if there are certain things that are very important to them, it's important that they tell their attorney so we can find a way to maybe get that into the agreement for them.
That's such great information for people to understand. And if they want to attend certain doctor visits or if they want certain communication, that's typically what I recommend they speak to the lawyers about. I don't know if that's correct or not. Uh,
Yeah, absolutely.
that is, and I have to say, when you start talking about the family that was your surrogate, you just glow. It's just like wonderful. So it's really a blessing. So if we talk about when somebody is first trying to conceive,
Mhm.
I think, and always correct me if I'm wrong, which I trust you will. So I think one of the first legal things that has to be looked at is the embryo disposition. And it's something
Yes.
that's overlooked a lot. Is you work so hard to get an embryo that many times, you lose sight of most anything else except to create, the embryo to have a child, and of course, that makes total sense. But you're also given, like, this stack of papers to sign, and
Yes.
one of those papers is what you're gonna do with your extra embryos. So, what happens there? What are those papers?
So you're absolutely correct. I mean, as an intended parent, I can speak to this also, as an attorney, I see my clients go through this. The focus for all of us, and I say us because I've been through it, when you're creating your embryos, you're going through IVF, you're doing all of these things, your focus is just on getting as many embryos as you can, as healthy embryos as you can, and you're not thinking about having extra embryos down the road. You're not thinking about all of these other things. And that's unfortunate because you need to think about these things. Really, what you're doing when you're signing these documents is you're making decisions that could affect you years down the road. Not to say that we can't make changes to those things, but it's important to know what these documents are, what they mean. Take the time, and I wish that clinics would give these to people a little bit sooner so that they could take the time to review them with an attorney, or even just spend more than a few minutes checking a box and that they really understood what their choices were. But generally, when you're creating an embryo with a clinic, they're going to give you, like you said, a stack of forms. And one of those forms is usually an embryo disposition form. Sometimes they call it consent, sometimes they call it an agreement. It's really not an agreement. It really is just a checkbox form, and it gives you different choices. And so the idea is, well, what do you want to happen to your embryos if you were to divorce, or if you were to separate, if you're unmarried, have some sort of a dissolution event? What about if you pass away? What about if you are still an intact family, but you're done with your family building? So these questions sometimes appear on these embryo disposition forms, and every clinic has its own form. So there is no standardization really of this. But it's important to give a good thought to what it is that you want to have done. Your choices may be to discard any remaining embryos. Your choices may be that you're going to use the remaining embryos. Your choices may be that you're going to donate the remaining embryos. And these choices and what is available to you is really dependent a lot of times on state law. We're seeing there are states now that have laws regarding what you can do with embryos. If embryos are considered to be people, well, you might be limited in your choices. And so we do have states that are placing a lot of limitations on what to do with embryos. And so you have to be mindful of that. And that's why talking to an attorney is important, because where your embryos are may affect what your choices are. And also, this area of the law is subject to change. We see a lot of changes in the last couple of years. We expect some more changes in the years going forward. And so we have to give a lot of thought to that. The state where you're creating your embryos and storing your embryos is relevant. What is happening in that location? Are your dispositional choices going to change? What you put down on that consent form, is that still going to be an option for you later? So these are all important considerations that when you're going through IVF, you're really just not focused on sort of that point of time. You're focused on creating your embryos and having a baby. But people need to take a little more time on that.
They do, and when you were talking about the state laws and, the differences, that's where we come into personhood, and that's
Yes.
where, you know, we're seeing so much talk, not direct talk, but talk about that, but that is, directly correlated to the disposition of the embryos in many ways.
Absolutely. I think a lot of lawmakers maybe did not realize or are still not realizing the unintended consequences of some of the laws that are coming into effect. Some judges are not really realizing the unintended consequences that this is affecting people who are using IVF, because you are creating multiple embryos when you're going through IVF. That's just the natural way of doing things. And so inevitably you end up with extra embryos. If you're, if you're very lucky, you end up with extra embryos. And what we can do with them, our choices may be limited by what's going on in the world around us. So we have to think about that. But the important thing is to, I think, talk to an attorney about what are your choices? Are they likely to remain your choices? And before you check the boxes on the forms, to know what it is that you're signing. But like I said, we can change things later on. If we're in a state where our choices are limited, perhaps moving the embryos might be an option down the road. If we've checked a box that no longer applies, we might be able to do things. Again, it depends on what state law is. Here in New York, we have something called an embryo disposition agreement. And so that's something that allows two folks that created embryos together to sort of allow one of them to continue to use the embryos, and the other person, who's the co-creator, to no longer be a legal parent of those children that are born of those embryos, no longer be a co-owner of the property, because embryos in New York State and in many places are considered property. And so we changed their legal status so that it allows one person to continue to create their family while the other person reverts to essentially a donor. And so that's an option here. It's not an option everywhere.
Right. So yeah, New York State has much more kind of open laws in many ways than others. And so just please pay attention to your state regulations and talk to your attorney, and recognize that if you have questions when you're filling out this embryo disposition form, ask. Right. That is the most important thing. Don't be afraid to ask. Thank you. That's so much information, really, I think, to take in, and a lot to cover. And so the other piece I think that's so important is people who are having children through donor conception, whether it be sperm donor, egg donor, embryo donation, all of those have legal ramifications. And I was
Correct.
wondering if we could talk to that a little bit, and maybe even the differences, because there are subtle differences between embryo donation and other types of donations.
That's correct. So when you're going through donation, it matters where you're getting the gametes from. And when I talk about gametes, I mean either sperm or egg. So if you're getting your gametes, your donor sperm or your donor egg, from a clinic or a bank, then sometimes the gametes have already been released to that bank or that clinic or that agency, that facility. And so the screenings that have been done of the donor have been done long before you're ever knowing of the existence of the donated egg or sperm. And so everything's kind of been taken care of in the background, and you're simply obtaining egg or sperm for donation. So there's not a lot of paperwork for you to sign, not a lot of agreements. There's no direct agreement between you and the donor. However, if you're going through an egg donation where there's a fresh cycle, meaning that an egg donor is going to go through a retrieval for you or for you and another family, but the point is she hasn't already released her eggs to the facility, if she's going to go through a fresh cycle, generally, whether it's a known donor or an unknown donor, and if you're going through an agency, it would be usually an unknown donor, not always, you would have a direct agreement between yourself and that donor. I've also had sperm donation agreements where a sperm donor is going through a fresh production of sperm for a family, and there's a direct agreement between them and the sperm donor. A little less likely, but it happens. And so you want to make sure that you have a legal agreement where both people are represented, or I should say both sides, if we want to say that. I don't really like to say sides because it's a collaboration, really, not an adversarial situation. But the donor side and the intended parent side both want to be represented by independent counsel. That's a best practice. In some places, that's required by law. And you want to make sure everyone has the opportunity to have their questions answered, have the laws explained to them, because people are really on the donor side giving up legal rights and responsibilities. And what does that mean? They want to, we want to make sure that they understand that. And the intended parents are accepting rights and responsibilities. Well, what does that mean? So we want to make sure they understand that as well. When it comes to a donation where you have a known donor, it's especially important to have a donation agreement that is negotiated through attorneys and each side is represented by independent legal counsel, because again, you want to make sure that people understand their rights and responsibilities. And with a known donation, generally it's with a family member, a friend of a friend, someone that you may come into contact with throughout your life. And so you really want to plan ahead. We talk about this as a donor conceived baby is on the way, and that's great. But what happens when the donor conceived baby is a donor conceived 5-year-old, and then a 12-year-old, and then a 20-year-old, and then a donor conceived 40-year-old? And so my job as an attorney is really to get people thinking past the, where do you need to show up for the sperm production or the egg retrieval, but how are we going to treat this donor conceived person and the fact that we have a donor conceived person in our lives in 40 years? How are we going to do that exchange of medical information? All of those things are important to cover in these donation agreements because it affects people throughout their lives. And legally speaking, you can't proceed with a donation, a fresh donation. The clinic won't proceed without getting a letter of legal clearance saying that, yes, in fact, there is this donation agreement in place. And that's because we will want to eventually get a parentage order in most cases. And so we'll need to show that they have satisfied the statute in whatever state they're in, if there is a statute, or adhered to case law. Here in New York, we'd have to show that there was donative intent. And so that's the purpose of having those agreements in that sense, so that we can show that we've met that standard and we make it easier for folks to get the right orders later. And I know you had asked about embryo donation. That's a specialized situation as well.
How much information, Jennifer, for people to think about?
I know.
It really is. It's like, oh my goodness. So it sounds so complicated, and it is and it isn't.
Right.
That's what I would say. I would say you have to empower yourself with knowledge, which is why we're talking today. But then understand that once you can take a minute, and pause and take all that information in, it's less overwhelming and it starts to make a lot of sense about what it is that you're doing and why you're doing it. So
Right.
that would just be my take on this.
I agree totally. And I think that's why it's important to work with an attorney that is specialized in the field of family formation,
Oh,
not
yeah.
just a traditional family law attorney or, your uncle who does, employment law or something, because it is so nuanced. And, we do this every day, my colleagues and I. And so we know how to take you from A to Z, how to get you through the path and to talk about the things that are important. The mental health professionals are crucial in this. The doctors are crucial. You really have to put together your entire team so that you are in good hands. But it is scary going through it the first time and not knowing, and for everyone, there is a first time. And so not knowing what's out there, it can be really scary. So that's why it's important to put together your team.
Yeah, I know, that's great advice. So for embryo donation,
Yes.
that's a whole different story. Not a
So
whole,
that's a little bit different.
little bit.
Yes. So when you're the recipient of donated embryos, we've had 2 people that have gone into the creation of those embryos. And so you really have to look back and think, well, where did the gametes, again, the sperm and the egg, come from in the creation of these embryos? Was the donor of the sperm a spouse or a partner of the person who who is donating the eggs that were used in the embryos that are ultimately donated? Are they available to sign off and be a party here? So is it a couple that is donating their own gamete created embryos? Or was donor egg or sperm used in the creation of those embryos? When it comes to donor sperm or egg being used in the creation of the embryos, you have to look back and see, well, what paperwork was involved in that first situation, that first arrangement? Was the sperm that was donated that come through a cryobank? If it came through a cryobank, well, what's the terms of use there? Are there restrictions there to further donation? Are there notice requirements? Do you have to notify the cryobank that there's now this new recipient of the embryos because they were created through this donated sperm? Are there future requirements of the new recipients that are now going to be the owners of these embryos? So what is it that you need to do? So you really need to look back at those initial agreements. If the embryos were created through the use of donation, but it was a known donor. Well, was there a known donation agreement? And was there a restriction there? A lot of times we put our restrictions in there customarily that says there can be no further donation without the consent of the donor, or not at all. And so it's important to know and to look back and to not just go ahead with an embryo donation unless you've looked at those initial papers from the first creation of the embryos.
Right. And so what would happen if somebody missed something? Do you know what I mean? Like what would typically happen if let's say you didn't realize that the embryo was that was being donated from a couple really was made with donor gamete?
Well, so hopefully that wouldn't happen, because the
Hopefully
job
not.
of the attorney is to really look into that and to ask those questions. Well, what was the donor egg or I'm sorry, what were the sperm and the egg that were used in the creation of these embryos, and to really investigate before they start drafting an embryo disposition, I'm sorry, an embryo donation agreement, where did these things come from? And to look back at those things. But let's say you missed it. Well, you have a situation where if you represent the recipients, they may be in violation of a notice requirement. They maybe had to notify an egg bank or cryobank or somewhere that they have had a pregnancy with these embryos. So maybe they're in violation. Maybe it's innocuous and it's not really that big of a deal and it can be easily cured. They now know that they need to notify the cryobank and they just provide their information and we can take care of that. In other cases, maybe they have violated something where it's really the donor has violated, because they were not supposed to redonate embryos. They were not supposed to redonate embryos that were created of donated sperm. And so now they're in violation of that. What's going to happen? I don't know. It's a potential for lawsuits, and that's an
I,
issue.
yeah, I have to say I've never asked that question before, and it was an interesting answer, not what I expected
Oh,
necessarily.
really?
Yeah, yeah. I didn't think the ramifications could be quite that significant. I
Mm.
thought they would be a little more lenient. My thought is, which is not legal, is that if you don't know, then you're bringing a donor conceived person into the world without knowing their genetic history and the impact
That's
that
true.
has on their life and their medical care and their emotional care. So
Yeah.
it's
All
important.
of those true.
Not legal, but true. And many times with surrogates, you don't when you're going for embryo donation, you don't realize that the people who are donating may have used both donor sperm and donor egg to create that embryo.
Right.
So it's interesting to keep that in mind because there's so many layers to embryo donation.
Yeah.
Um, that
It's
we
interesting.
it is interesting.
When
It,
it comes to New York, in surrogacy agreements, we actually have to state where the egg and the sperm came from, and the surrogate sees that, so the surrogate would know. And all the parties involved would know, okay, the sperm and the egg came from the intended parents, or hey, they used a donor egg in this situation. So everyone knows, and it's upfront.
yeah, yeah. Well, that's what I love about and you worked on that law. You were.
I didn't actually, so I can't take credit
Oh,
there,
I
but a lot
thought
of
you
my
did.
colleagues did. No, I didn't.
That's when I met you the first time. It was at the celebration for the law passing. So I thought
Yes.
you did work on that.
Well, I was
Okay.
celebrating it because I was a user of it. I was
I
a supporter
know.
of it, but
Well, I'm
I did
glad I
not
met
work
you
on
there
it.
either way. So that was wonderful. And so then when somebody becomes a recipient parent, now they have a child, through donor conception, whether it be egg, sperm, or embryo,
Mhm.
or they've used a surrogate. Is there anything they need to know legally?
When they are a recipient parent,
But when they already have the child, so the child is brought into the world, they've signed all these papers, they've dotted all their I's, crossed all their T's. Is there anything legally that they need to know or look back at?
well, I mean, by that point, if they're going through surrogacy, they would be, if they have the child with them, they likely have a parentage agreement already. I'm sorry, a parentage order already. So
We
they've
hope.
had attorneys there
Okay.
most of the time, unless the baby came very early, and in which case they have to sort of backtrack and work through the legal system a little bit quicker if they can, so that they can get an order. If you are a parent of a child that was born using donor conception, well, then you have to give consideration to, well, do I need to do anything further? And, I always bring it back to the parentage order, because is it absolutely necessary to get a parentage order in every case? No, but in the law, we talk about something called like the boots and suspenders approach. And so we really want to make people as secure as possible, which is really what that means. And so why not be secure? Why not know that you're not going to have a donor that comes back years later and suddenly tries to assert rights? Why not, as a donor, know that you're not going to have intended parents and recipients and ultimately parents of donor conceived people come back later and start saying that, oh no, you're another parent, you owe us child support. And so we want to make sure that everyone,
Parents do that?
people can try anything. People can bring lawsuits anytime they
I
want for
never,
anything.
yeah, I haven't heard of that, but I mean, I've heard that people can do it, but I haven't really heard of any cases where people do it. So that's what I was asking.
Well, it's nice to know that having a court order sort of puts that to rest.
The suspenders, yeah.
Yeah. And so I always say that preparing for the parentage order is best if you've used any type of donor conception. A lot of LGBT folks think that the parentage laws are very targeted towards that community, and I understand how it feels that way. And I always like to bring up that it's not strictly because people are LGBT that they may need to get a parentage order. It's because they use donor conception. And so we want to make clear who is and who is not a parent. And we want to make sure that there is no donor that is entitled to parental rights and has parental obligations. We just want to clearly state who is and who is not a parent. And so really anyone that uses donor conception, and understandably, more than anyone, the LGBT community does use donor conception, but anyone who uses donor conception can benefit from having a parentage order.
Yeah, I think that's such an important clarification to make so that people don't feel singled out. So thank you.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So much information. Thank you.
Yeah, I could talk forever. I don't want to because I
Gotcha.
don't want.
Yeah. I'm wondering if there's any other like key takeaways that people should like investigate where they are, that you didn't cover because you've covered so much.
I would just say that this is a moving target and there's a lot to it. Like you said, we just touched on little bits of things on each of these areas. There's a whole lot more to it. And so it's really just important to speak to the right people, speak to the mental health professionals so you can talk through what your choices are and what the ramifications are socially and emotionally, and then talk to an attorney so that you could talk through what are the ramifications, what are the requirements, what are the processes that we need to follow to put ourselves in the position that we hope to be in legally. And so it's important to assemble your team. And like I said, it's a moving target. Things are changing very rapidly in this area of the law. And so we have to keep our eyes on what's happening in our states, in our areas, because that affects how we can build our families.
Yeah. Well, thank you. So well said, really. So well said. And please know that all the information that Jennifer shared today, all this education that we got today is so important for us to know and then take it with us and apply it to our states and just see, how it fits and how it's comfortable and talk about it. Don't not talk about it. Talk to your doctor, talk to a mental health provider, talk to a lawyer, talk about it so that you understand it. And if something you decide to make a change, it sounds like you probably could change the documents, but always better to go in there like kind of with some sense of security of what it is that you want.
Yes, consents are just that. They're consents. And generally, they are not done with the benefit of counsel. They could be, but usually they're not. Usually people are just signing these things. And that's why we have other agreements that can supersede those consents. And sometimes those consents are just for internal protocols and they don't really affect things other than how the clinic is going to proceed. Perhaps they can be used as evidence if there's litigation, but why get to the point of litigation? So if there's other documents that you can execute, it might be worth considering doing that.
Well, thank you, Jennifer. Thank you so much. I
Of
really,
course.
it's such a wealth of information and education today. So if anybody wants to get a hold of you, how would they do that?
Well, they can visit my website. So my website is www.jpm. So it's like John Paul Mary, or my initials, Jennifer P. Moss, jpmfertilitylaw.com. And they could submit a contact form and we can set up some sort of a consult and have a conversation. I also have a lot of blogs on there and information. So if people want to look further for some more information, they can certainly check that out.
Oh, God. And I really have to say, you can tell from this podcast, she is like such a wealth of information that I can listen to Jennifer talk for hours. So
Oh,
thank you so much. No, thank you, really. And if anybody needs any information or would like to get hold of me, please feel free to contact me at lauriemetz@ymail.com. Thank you.
yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna pause this if I can see where to pause it. And I gotta take a second to pause it.